We are ready to blast off. So hello, everyone. My name is Mihua Steger. Welcome back to your LaRouche PAC Monday Strategic Overview with Michael Steger. It's Monday, July 11th, 2022. And since we were together last week, so much has happened in the world. Certainly, you probably saw the resignation of Boris Johnson and also the unfortunate assassination of Shinzo Abe in Japan. I think Mike is going to develop this even further, potentially in his remarks. What I'd like to go through is really what's happening in the United States. What is on the minds of most Americans today, what's at the forefront of their minds is certainly not what you're seeing captured in the media or projected in the media. What I would emphasize is the two rallies that President Trump did in Nevada as well as Alaska. And you're going to continue to see these developing. But, you know, the fundamental issue and really the task at hand, at least a short-term task, is that we must do everything within our power to get President Trump reelected in 2024. That has to happen. There's really no negotiation on that. It doesn't mean that once that happens, it's the end all be all, we're done, we can wipe our hands of, you know, any responsibility of further action. What it does mean is that our actions going into the midterm 2022 elections, and then of course the 2024 presidential election, I imagine what we have to do is we have to develop the America First, American system legacy that's going to be able to take place and take hold over the next 1 to 2 generations, or at least certainly have an impact into the coming generations. Because if we want to eradicate the control of this globalist, you know, corporatist mechanism, then it's going to take that amount of time to be able to really transform and transcend the culture that we're a part of, the culture of the United States. It's fundamental that this was a nation and republic built upon and founded upon the principle of creativity and the expression of our unique, you know, God-given ability to create, to transform the human species. And that's really the power of the United States. That's why the United States leading the world, whatever happens in the world, certainly it should be spearheaded by this kind of conception, that human beings are good, fundamentally good, and that we need to develop the supportive systems and platforms by which people have the potential to express that God-given talent. So, I mean, I would say, like I said, you probably saw the rallies by President Trump. Those are always good to watch, get a sense of what's really on his mind, where he's thinking of going. Where this America First movement is really intends to go. And there's, I mean, clearly, if you saw what happened in Nebraska, I mean, it's really pretty remarkable, the kind of situation that's unfolding inside the United States. I myself saw it at the Michigan GOP convention, on the convention floor, the kind of fights that are taking place to eradicate really the voice of President Trump within the Republican Party. It's not just rhinos, it's establishment, it's neocon, it's these old guard type networks that really are unwilling to let go. And the only way they're going to let go is if we go in there and manhandle, essentially, in your mind, not physically manhandle, although maybe sometimes that's necessary. But manhandle them and just, take back control of our nation, take back control of the future and spirit of our nation and the soul of our nation, because that's, as I said last week, that's really in our hands. So just to give you a sense of Nebraska, I mean, within the course of, I believe it was 10, 12 hours, I mean, what they had was they ousted the GOP chairman, and you had at least a dozen, I think it was a dozen resignations from GOP leaders in Nebraska. And by that evening, by Saturday evening, the state's, Nebraska's dominant political party, really, they lost a chairman, they lost their executive director, they lost 2 out of 3 of their district chairs, I believe. The national committee woman resigned. I mean, the list goes on and on. 3 assistant state party chairs, the secretary, the treasurer, a lawyer. You just saw people jump ship. And what this indicates, and like I said, the indication that I also got a sense of at the Michigan GOP convention, is that there is a demand to stick to principle. The principle really that this nation expresses, which is all encompassing, but just to give you a sense, the principle of growth, the principle that we're going to become energy independent, we're going to become food secure, we're going to continue to break the boundaries of science and culture, and fight for the future. So what's on most Americans' minds is currently, I mean, the question of hyperinflation, how young people are going to raise a family. If you're getting married right now, where are you going to raise your kids? Where are they going to go to school? How are you going to put food on the table? What's their future going to look like? That is the fundamental concern. It's the economic situation, it's the cultural situation. So you joining us this evening, every week, bringing your friends on is crucial, because this dialogue, this discussion continues every week. And when you tune in, it's like a dynamic that continues to develop, that shapes your mind, that shapes how you're going to communicate what you're discovering to those that you come in contact with. So thank you for joining us. I think with that, I'd like to invite Michael to come on and let us know what he's thinking about.
Great, thanks, Mihua. All right, as usual, it's great to be here. Thanks for attending, taking time out of your schedule to participate in these discussions. There's really nothing more important. As the email that was sent out for the event, the meeting tonight, patriots everywhere need to be convening. And this is why what Mihua went through in Nebraska is so key. And here in Michigan, it's an outright public fight between Trump and the oligarchs like the DeVos family. Betsy DeVos actually came out with a book and a series of PR interviews basically denouncing Trump after the January 6th incident as part of this entire coup operation. Now, the more these people expose themselves, the better, but there really is a fight for the country. And it's not unique to our nation, actually. And that's why some of these international events are interesting. I want to give some background and context to some of these things. And I want to, and then we'll see what you guys are thinking as well, and continue this process. But, this fight for, you could say a real Republican Party, but what you need is a vehicle for patriots. And one of the key questions, we talked about this a few weeks ago with New York, the question of creating a political organization, in this case, a political party, which was seen in Nebraska. It was a hostile takeover of the party, is to create a vehicle where you can provide a policy orientation, a direction of the country that represents 85%, 90% of the country. That's possible. That's what the LaRouche coalition really is. You see this with the Hispanic vote today, 50, 60+%. You could see in at least some areas voting now Republican. We saw this special election down in McAllen, Texas, elect the first Mexican-born member of Congress, Mayra Flores. The same could be done with even the African Americans in the inner city. You want to talk about securing elections and ending these kind of corrupt inner city machines? Recruit the people there with the sense that going with electric cars, shutting down farming and carbon energy is somehow going to, and increasing drug use and abortions is somehow going to improve their life. But you've got to offer an alternative, right? Rebuilding the industries, addressing the crime questions, addressing the drug questions, getting real content-based education in these places. That can be done. It can be done quickly. You just have to mobilize the nation. So that's really what we've got to do. And as Miqua indicated, this is a question of the next few months. Where Trump is at least discussing, announcing. Now, some of these things are playing with media stories and media cycles. But he is in the process of forming his incoming team, campaign team, and the people that are going to shape policy. And the one thing hopefully Trump has learned is that personnel is policy. Bringing in Pompeo, bringing in Bolton doesn't suffice. Bringing in DeVos ain't going to cut it. Pence won't cut it. Might get you elected. That's partly why I brought some of these people in. But at this point now, he doesn't need those. He doesn't need, coat tailors. What he needs is a policy and people that can represent a real national program for the country. Now, I want to get into some of these international events. And the idea is to shape that process with these discussions, and hopefully these discussions help shape what we do. And of course, going out to political events, national state conventions, we are going to have a resolution out. I think it should be out sometime later today, and people can check the website, and if it's out, we can post it by the end of this call. But it should be on the website soon, and you'll get an email reminder of it. But it's a question of hands off Trump. But it's a message not to Pelosi and the Democratic Party, which at this point is just purely treasonous. There may be some better layers in the population that still identify, but far from anything political in terms of organization. But it's to the Republicans. Where's their fight? Where's their backbone? What are they fighting for? Why are they making compromises on red flag laws and adopting basically letting the Democrats set the agenda? When the real problem is you don't get rid of the guns, you get rid of the drugs. How hard is that to say? Shut down the drugs. That's a key component of this. So anyway, so there are things like that. And so what we want to do is get this resolution out. You're going to see it. I think you're going to like it. It makes the right point. And it's going to be sent to the Senate and House Republican campaign committees, as well as to the state Republican campaign committees, with the point of, we're demanding this. The American people are demanding that you fight for this kind of commitment and development of the country. So we just want to echo that, provide some ammunition, allow people a chance to get out there and organize as much as possible this summer with campaigns. And certainly this autumn is going to be so important. Securing these critical states like Nevada and Arizona, Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin, Georgia, these are going to be real fights. All of them are having gubernatorial elections. Only one of them is an incumbent Republican. So it's going to be a real question of making sure we secure some of these key states and begin to move the nation really towards a fundamental shift. And that doesn't happen once Trump gets elected. It has to be in motion. When FDR did it in 1933, with things like Glass-Steagall, the Tennessee Valley Authority, these things were already in motion. Glass-Steagall was on the books for nearly a year of discussion by members of Congress. Trump can do the same thing. Bully pulpit the members of the House and Senate and the Republican Party, shape that dynamic, shape your cabinet, really mobilize the governors, get governors and state legislatures to start thinking about how do they get their economies moving. If you listen to the Alaska speech, he referenced how a number of things he did in Alaska were on the agenda of Alaska state political figures. He found out from them what needed to get done, and then he brought the federal power of the executive to make sure those things happened. We're in that kind of process today, but we're also mired in the most severe economic crisis our country's ever seen. This is a culmination of 5 decades, 6 decades of economic destruction of our industrial production, and a cultural disorientation, whether it be abortion, the drugs, the sex and culture and identity. All of these things have been festering for 50, 60 years. And they've been running financial bubbles on top of that the entire time. So, so we've got a reckoning here with this financial system, and why our campaign to end the Fed, to replace it with a functioning national banking system, but to drive the industrial process of the country is so important. Okay, so that's why we're here. That's the mission. I want to cover some of these international aspects just to give some context, because what we really see when we take a step back and look at the big picture is a process of, and what you might say is an evolutionary leap in human culture. A kind of, if not a new discovery, a rediscovery of the question of the nation state and of real production. And you see it manifest in different ways. It's far from consolidated. And you might say that the most important is that lead duck of the United States. Are we going to vector this potential transformation of nations globally? But one thing that's really interesting, and President Trump will have more to say with this when he gets, this is part of what the next administration is going to be about. But talk about looking at the big picture. I just want to do a quick screen share. This popped out at 5 p.m. today. This is only a taste. We're going to see a lot more of it tomorrow. Let me just do this, then I'll jump into the international picture. All right, what you're looking on your screen is a new picture for the first time released today of the James Webb telescope, space telescope. So this is a brand new, it's like a 21-meter, 6-array, gold-plated or beryllium-plated kind of hexagonal shields to build the biggest infrared telescope in space ever deployed. Deployed a little over a year ago, I think, or actually deployed longer than that, but finally established less than a year ago in its location, its Lagrange point. But the reason this picture, and it's of course a beautiful picture, and I think we're going to see far more. They're not going to let the best out of the bag. All of these are galaxies. It was really just about 100 years ago that we even realized there was more than one galaxy in the universe. Now there are trillions. But what's perhaps most interesting with this is the fact that we're now going to see deeper and farther, both in space and in time, of our universe than we've ever seen before. It's a magnitude greater than the Hubble telescope, which of course shaped a lot of new discoveries about the nature of our universe. There's also another telescope called the Gaia, poorly named, that's actually doing the most in-depth mapping of the motions of stars in our galaxy and of galaxies otherwise, to give us the most detailed mapping of the motions of things more within our environment, still fairly distant, but not as much as the James telescope. So we're going to be able to take a picture of the universe now and begin to get a sense of something far more, I think, profound. And the reason I say that, I mean, just look at some of the detail, look at some of the spiral galaxies like over here. I mean, some of the detail of these galaxies is extraordinary. And it really is going to be, you can see some of the disc-like nature of these things, some of the more interesting shapes like this one here. I mean, it'll be fun to find out. but these very distant galaxies, because part of the problem we've been living in is a scientific assumption, and this assumption has been ontological, meaning it pertains to the nature of the creator itself. That it's top down at the highest question. What's governing and organizing the universe as a whole? Part of the imposition of science, of liberal science upon our culture today has been a notion of the Big Bang. That would mean the universe is only 14 billion years old. So you got to think, our sun is about 5 billion years old, our planet's like 4 billion, and the entire universe that you're looking at one small picture of right here, that's only 14 billion. Like, no, I don't really think so. I don't really think all of this is took only 3 times longer than our star, our sun and planetary system. I'm thinking it was a little longer. Some hypotheses are that it would be trillion. My hypotheses would be you're never going to be able to put a time metric on the creation of our universe. Because how do you measure something that's eternal? So, but that question and challenging this absurd theory, which over the last 4 or 5 years, this Big Bang theory, it's literally what they call it. I mean, it's like, it sounds like a really bad, many different things, but I'm sure you can figure it out. You know, it's not a good name, not a good way of thinking of the universe in any way whatsoever. The expectations of that theory have, over the last 4 or 5 years, increasingly begun to fail. There are now up to 16 severe failures in this cosmological theory. I'm not going into those. That may be for another class. If you want a class on that, put it in the chat box and maybe we'll figure out how to do it. It would be possible. But the point is that these imposed theories about our universe, I've talked to students on campuses who, from that presumption of the Big Bang as 14 billion years old, and it's going to go into a big crunch and it's going to freeze and it's going to go through entropy and the whole universe is going to collapse. They're like, what's the point of life? It's meant to be an existential conception versus one of creation, of ongoing living creation, which is what you see before you. This is the creation of our universe, ongoing. And it's remarkable. And this is a small, just the smallest, subsection of the nighttime sky. And yet it's as if it's an entire universe in and of itself. It's just extraordinary. And part of this is Trump's presidency, the second term. Part of this is the question of, we're going to have the 250th birthday of our country in 2026. We are going to be accelerating the Artemis project to put men and women on the moon permanently, human beings on the moon heretofore in the course of the rest of human civilization, and onward to Mars, and the exploration, even more so, not just of planets, but of the principles, the underlying principles of the creation we hold before us in this new image. What are the principles that are shaping something so beautiful and extraordinary that we as human beings can contemplate? It's that, in my mind, which makes the concept of abortion so criminal, because there is nothing in the universe that can even approximate the power of the human mind to contemplate the entirety of the universe, to explore it, to come to measure it and manifest it in the way we are with this picture, and then to come to then hypothesize and to discover the principles shaping such a wondrous place. So, okay, with that said, that's our philosophical venue for, segment for the night. Let me just jump into, someone's asked a question about Glass-Steagall. Yeah, we'll get to that in the Q&A. Thanks for asking that. Feel free to drop things in the chat box if you're wondering them during the discussion. It'll help us make sure we get to everybody's thoughts. Okay, so let me just run through a few things on this this global picture. Meanwhile, mentioned Boris Johnson's resignation. There's been some intelligence released by the website Gray Zone, which is a number of young and relatively thorough and directly under attack by British intelligence journalists. They received a series of emails that they've said they've qualified. I trust their perspective. I don't think they would fake it, though there's all kinds of attempts to bait people into doing something, that to identify that Richard Dearlove, the former head of MI6, responsible for the false intelligence that was fed to Bush and Cheney that created the Iraq War, the dodgy dossier, that Dearlove, who was also responsible for the coup run by British intelligence, including Christopher Steele. Dearlove was his former boss, beginning back in 2015, 2016. That Dearlove was part of a cabal of both top-level oligarchical financiers, intelligence operatives, and people inside some of the bureaucracies, undermining Theresa May's administration, perhaps, and their motives are suggested to be to now bring the United States under Trump closer to the UK, which was an explicit call of the House of Lords in their report in 2018. But that Dearlove would have directly involved, then brought down May's administration by basically undermining her Brexit negotiations. Their reasons were that because May was allowing civil servants to destroy Brexit, which is probably true, that Brexit was never going to happen or it was going to be milquetoast. They brought in Johnson, but Johnson became captured by similar interests. The point is that you are dealing with a period that is consequential for this century, that the decisions and actions unfolding before us, and predominantly beginning that summer of 2016 with the Brexit vote, and then Trump's election that fall, with a fundamental shift in where this planet, where nation states, where our nation is going. There's a real potential shift. And the fact that Trump has kept fighting has been a critical factor in that. So part of this is the scrambling of whether you call it crown interests, globalist interests in Britain. Certainly that's what Dearlove and this faction represent, is globalist interests, as does the crown, to try to control and manipulate the situation and deal with what is national uprisings. That's what Brexit was. People are sick in Great Britain of watching their country be torn to pieces by this liberal EU imperial model. So now Johnson began to fail largely out of the COVID dynamic. He's also just kind of a corrupt and kind of incompetent. The guy was dripping with just pure ambition. He dropped people left and right purely out of ambition, kept getting caught in lies, and he just was no longer a decent representative. What comes out of this is unclear, but I can tell you right now, he was not removed because of his glowing adoration for Vladimir Zelensky and the potential world war with Russia. He was entirely favored from that regard. That's Dearlove, that's Steele, that's this entire operation. It was his inability to maintain some kind of real leadership of this national uprising, or control it, you might say, in Great Britain. We'll see what comes with the next prime minister. I would be surprised if it's a Brexiter. Most of the candidates running are Remainers, ultimately, but they'll now serve the interests that are necessary. And I imagine all of them will be hard line on this Ukraine situation, but let's see what unfolds. Now, the Abe assassination perhaps is a little bit more, there's clearly a threat involved to leaders who represent this national uprising. There's a lot of speculation of where this came from. Clearly, his security was far from what was necessary. And so there was something left incredibly open, like what we saw with JFK. The security was way insufficient. The same is true here. But if people don't know, Abe represented something substantial. He was working to consolidate a new type of treaty agreement with Russia, regarded islands in the far north that have been in Russian territory since the end of World War II. This is a big question for Japan, these islands and this whole perspective. Abe also, as someone mentioned, was pro-Taiwan, and certainly that's the case. Some people put it, there are two factions in Taiwan, one pro-China, the other one pro-Taiwan. I'm sorry, pro-Japan. But Japan creates a balance of power in East Asia. Both Japan and China are massively dependent on oil coming through the Straits of Malacca in Southeast Asia. This is why this South China Sea is such a critical strategic area. Both the number 2 and 3 largest economies in the world are dependent on energy supply coming through that area of the world, the South China Sea. This is why this is so strategic. But Abe had developed close ties with President Trump. He came to see him in Trump Tower in New York right after the election. They developed close relations, and President Trump may even attend his funeral on Tuesday. Abe worked closely with Putin and wanted to resolve this, and ultimately left a few years ago from the prime ministership merely because of, well, I guess because of physical illness. He had also worked closely with Prime Minister Modi. All of these figures, and he had worked to try to help improve relationships with China in some way. And I think to some extent that was true. The Taiwan may be different, but in general, he represented somebody who wanted to revive Japan as a major national force in world policy. This is consistent with Japan's economic capability and the role they play in things like the Asia Development Bank. He wanted to bring back, and this may now happen, there were elections in Japan on Sunday, and Abe's party now in coalition have 2/3 of parliament. They can now make constitutional changes. This may mean Japan may come back with a full military. Now, you know, some people have trepidations over Japan or Germany regaining their national militaries. Such things have to be considered. But the question is establishing a new perspective, a new relationship among nations, where metrics of development and key investments are critical. And the role of the United States in all of that is perhaps paramount. And that's what a lot of, you know, old leftists around the world have a problem understanding, that as much as the United States has made many mistakes from Vietnam, even Korea, certainly the Iraq situation and Libya, made serious mistakes, the role of the United States and the outlook of the American people are of most critical significance in shaping the strengthening and revival of a nation-state system, not this liberal system where we police all of the world and we control all the money. This is insane. We've got to get back to developing the United States. That's our role, and bringing that quality of outlook to these other places. Abe represented that kind of national outlook. So his assassination is concerning. The power of his party is now growing significantly. We'll see what happens and unfolds if they consolidate some of Abe's political legacy. But as I mentioned, he developed close relationships with Modi. This process of Modi is interesting. It's also interesting in terms of what Modi's brought to India in terms of a national revival of an Indian reflex, of building up the industrial and scientific base of India. It's interesting, though, when you look at the dynamic globally, you see also something happening in terms of mass ferment of the population. You saw this in India over a year ago, where farmers insisted that there be no liberalization. Now, in some cases, this might have been, but under the current world globalist tendencies, Indian farmers would have an understandable distrust of any liberalization of farming. They came out in the masses to shut this down. They recognize that they've got to have the ability to have a guarantee of food production. And it's also a national security question for India. What we've seen with Putin is something similar in terms of a national revival. And that's why this whole question of Ukraine, at this point, Russia has dominated the East. There's talks of a possible move to the south by Ukraine. We'll see what happens. A lot of this is bluster from Zelensky. But what the globalists don't understand is that when political leaders represent the actual interests of their population, they mobilize broad movements. This became a strategic factor, that idea, and this is what Putin has done to marshal the support of the Russian people, that this quality is something that was brought to bear by the American Revolution and then was brought to Europe with the army of people like Lazare Carnot, who was directing the French army prior to the rise of Napoleon's dictatorship. And it shocked the rest of Europe because the army mobilized, deployed, and fought at a much higher level of effectiveness than anything in Europe, because there was now an engagement of the citizen with the direct interest of their country and the mobilization of the political forces of the population in terms of engage in direct combat. Remember, the Ukrainians actually voted for Zelensky because they wanted him to talk to Russia overwhelmingly. So what does that tell you about the mindset of the Ukrainian people today? Did Zelensky fulfill their interests? It's a complete failed state. And this is what we've got to begin to solve and change. So we're looking at big potential changes. But there's a couple of other things. You have the Dutch farmers. This has become a massive revolt. Many of you have probably seen it. They want a 70% reduction of nitrogen. This is basically targeting the dairy farmers, but farmers across the board, because it's a full food cycle. And it's fertilizer, and it's methane, and Holland in the Netherlands is the second largest food exporter in the world after the United States. This is a small country in Northwest Europe. And yet it's massively productive with a lot of family farms. It's advanced technology. They've invested massively in a lot of their land quality in terms of the system of water and marshes. This has been historic, but they've done it at the most advanced level. The locks that we built outside New Orleans to protect it from flooding from hurricanes was based on what had been developed in the Netherlands. This is an advanced national security interest that they're now just shutting down. And it's a rabid green mentality. The farmers have had enough. The population is revolting and supportive. The fishermen are supportive. There are now reports of farmers in Poland, Germany, and Italy supporting this. I'm sure the French possibly also, or Belgium. But there is a sense this is psychotic. This is like Brian D. saying we're going to keep rising the gas prices because we've got to save the liberal world order. We've got to shut down the farmers, eliminate the food supply, make you dependent. When there's a talk of food shortages and famines just coming down the corner because of COVID lockdowns and the so-called Russia invasion, all of these supposed things are going to create a huge food crisis. They want to shut down the food supply of the second largest food exporter in the world. These globalists are insane. They're like the French elites during the revolution there. They've lost all sanity. They are just massively degenerate, and they are assuming they can impose this on a population. Now, Europe is a struggling place because it's lost national sovereignty. We've got to bring that back to Europe. We've got to strengthen Europe and strengthen these nations, as we do with nations around the world. Similar is true in Africa or South America. We've got to strengthen these national interests and the responsibility to gain the consent of the governed. So now part of this, and part of the overall situation we're dealing with, is an environment of the COVID lockdowns, combined with this radical depopulation agenda, whether it's, call it Davos, globalists, the British. It is a radical depopulation agenda. It does really center out of London as a long-term conspiracy. Brussels and the EU are a major, massive bureaucracy. Just to give you a quick note on how the EU runs, the Parliament of the European Union doesn't even develop legislation. All of that's developed by what they call their executive commission. They set up everything, and then they send it to the parliament to be kind of passed. It really is a complete, it's almost like the revival of the Holy Roman Empire in its worst possible form. So we've got to revive the nation state. But you see the same problem in a place like Sri Lanka. If people haven't seen this, you get a sense that there is upheaval taking place. And Sri Lanka could be the first of many nations, including Tunisia, Egypt, which were both part of the Arab Spring, Turkey, and other nations around the world. There is massive debt. There is a massive dependency on food imports. There's a massive dependency on foreign loans and tourism. And all of this has been thrown way off kilter into massive instability, a kind of a reckless acceleration from the hardcore global COVID lockdowns, the so-called China model of COVID approach. And so Sri Lanka was hit hard by this, but their president in that context decided to shut down of all the things they import. And this is a relatively large island. It's 22 million people. It probably has the capability of food self-sufficiency with major investments. The president shut down, of all things, importation of fertilizer. They went to then local fertilizers and natural methods versus the nitrogen-based, manufactured fertilizers. And there was a massive shortage in food production and the yield per acre, leading to then food shortages, complete political instability. A prime minister has already resigned. A second is about to or already has. The president was literally run out of his country, got onto a naval ship and is maybe a soul off the coast. I don't know where it stands at this moment, but it was a massive, and people were found swimming in the presidential swimming pool. Governments are failing in this globalist order. And it's the responsibility of leading nations like the United States, like India, China, Russia, Japan, perhaps leading nations of Europe, if we can revive them as nations. But there's got to be an orientation rapidly in this direction to make sure that we secure the population's stability globally and can rapidly move towards the kind of financial conditions for each nation to begin to thrive based on the talents of its own people, where their industrial capabilities, scientific capabilities, agricultural and productive areas, those areas have to be mobilized rapidly. Much like President Trump has to do with each state here. You've got a massive Western drought. This is a growing crisis. We've got to mobilize these Western governors and state legislatures to figure out what steps we can take. Now, we know we've mapped out the NWAPA project, but all of them have to do an immediate study, which includes NWAPA, to begin to verify as a political discussion in their state, is this the best option? There are other things we can do. Ionization is certainly one of them. We can see how this functions in certain places. You've got to rapidly move, and you're going to need federal backing, but you're going to need the states to take responsibility to implement it and move it. That's what a federal system is. And the national banking allows that to be backed up with credit that doesn't get governed by Wall Street. It gets governed by the fact that this is where we want to move as a nation. And you have that deliberation and discussions, and the states get backing and have access to financing and credit at low interest rates when it's for things like water infrastructure. That's what congressional legislation can do. So I'm giving this as an example. That same kind of thing then has to be marshaled as an international development or economic system and financial system globally, where you make sure that other nations have access to the credit they need to become industrial and productive nations. If we don't do that, you're going to see what's been happening at our southern border continue. And no matter what we do there, if you foster absolute economic Armageddon south of our border, or in Europe, throughout North Africa, Africa, and Southwest Asia, you will continue to get a rush of people looking for mere survival. That's why Lyndon LaRouche called back in the 1940s and 50s for this kind of economic system, because it should have been done then. Well, sometimes it takes us, mankind, a little while to learn a lesson. Hopefully we're now learning it. But this is truly the potential that with a functioning presidency like President Trump, establishing this kind of course of action now with the bully pulpit on Congress. He doesn't have to become Speaker of the House. He just has to determine what that speaker does in terms of getting legislation moving. So when he walks in, it's written, it's been studied, we're moving on it. But it's not just what we can revive here. It's what will happen as a revival of national development globally. The example of this is Abraham Lincoln. What Lincoln did in 4 years with national rebellion. The traitors, like they are today, were in full daylight. You see them everywhere. They come out like Betsy DeVos did here. You see them, or Nikki Haley, or Liz Cheney, or you name it, right? They're there. Let alone we know many others. I mean, we could spend all night just mentioning the people. But in 4 short years, Lincoln was able to marshal a full industrial development of our nation as a continental nation. There weren't even states all the way through to the Pacific, and yet we marshaled a continental nation. He was having Army Corps of Engineers map out the course of the Transcontinental Railroad. He was establishing new banking systems to foster stability. They were developing new textile manufacturing systems and industrial processes for the production of the war. He established land-grant universities to study advancements in engineering, engines for industrial purposes, and agricultural research and tools and technology for farming. And in doing what he did, nations like Germany became the advanced industrial nations they became because they followed and modeled the Lincoln model. Russia, similarly. Japan, similarly. Mexico, to some degree. The nations we think of as advanced industrial nations that dominated the 20th century came to dominate it because of the industrial and scientific and political cultural changes Abraham Lincoln made in 4 years during national rebellion. It's extraordinary. It's what happens when you mobilize a people, because it wasn't just Lincoln. It was to mobilize the population, to mobilize that kind of national movement, that broad consent of the governed, to make something like that happen. And it was then continued after Lincoln. It was continued for almost 40 or 50 years with an incessant acceleration until we get into the Federal Reserve and World War I, and you start to dismantle that cultural fabric of our country. We can do that same thing today. That's really what we're discussing. We had our first of a lengthy class series on this revival of the true American soul. Last Saturday, I would encourage people to watch it. It should be on the website by now, and to participate in the upcoming Saturday discussions. But we really are at an extraordinary moment. It's an international situation. But what we do here is of the greatest significance, and consolidating this movement, broadening it out, and bringing in more and more of the American people with no assumptions of who can be brought in. We know there are oligarchical factions that will not be brought in. But the broad swath of the population does not exist based on the categories of the CRT postmodernist agenda. They are by nature human beings with interest towards the future of our society and our civilization, and they are human beings that contemplate and have the power to the broad nature of our universe and its stars. And we're going to bring that to bear in this political fight. So it's really kind of what I wanted to say tonight. Happy to see the attendance and the engagement. So why don't people jump into the queue, raise your hands, and Mijo, I'll throw it back to you and see what people are thinking.